Welcome to Studio 58A Live here at the Jamaica Information Service, our online discussion program coming to you live from the Jamaica Information Service. I'm your host, Vaughn Davis. Thank you so much for your eyes wherever they are around the world. Thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. Now, remember to share and subscribe, and most importantly, drop something down in the comments to help keep the conversation going, all right? Now, people, it's one of the hottest conversations in Jamaica right now. How do we deal with paternity fraud? Some say we need the laws to change to bring in some serious sanctions. Some say we need mandatory DNA testing at birth, and a whole lot of other things have been said. But until those things actually happen, what do you do if you find yourself the victim of paternity fraud? Well, today we're going to try and answer that question with help from our guest, attorney at law, Shuana Kay Smith, who specializes in family law. Welcome, Shuana. Thank you so much for being here. All right?
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so Shuana, I'm a man, just find out so the child I've been fathering is a jacket, me hurt, me angry, me frustrated, and I need justice. What do I do? What's my recourse? What do I do from there?
Very well. So, to set the context, I want us to define paternity fraud so we are all on the same page, right? So paternity fraud is the intentional misattribution or misidentification of a child's biological father. Mm-hmm. And we're focusing on intentional. Right. I recognize
underline and bold, highlight, italic the word intentional. That will be very important in the conversation going forward.
Definitely. And then there are two main areas of law, mm-hmm. criminal law and civil law. Mm-hmm. So criminal law, as the name suggests, deals with crimes, exactly. Right? And then we have the civil arena whereby party and party mm-hmm. can have some redress in the court system. So from the civil perspective, really we'll be looking at fraud or the tort mm-hmm. of deceit. That would be the cause of action that someone who claims to be the victim of paternity fraud, that's the cause of action that he would want to bring in the court, right? Now, from the criminal perspective, there are many different options that are available. But the truth is, we don't necessarily have, well, I'm not aware of any incident in Jamaica of an actual prosecution in relation to paternity fraud.
Okay.
So
well, you never know. There could be the first time for everything. You know? So maybe there's some guy out there right now who might feel like, you know what, something I'm going to try out for this though. I think we should go through them all the same to at least to establish what they are so people can understand, right?
Very well. So the nomenclature of paternity fraud will not appear in our legislation mm-hmm. or in case law, right? But there are other offenses that will, for example, be relevant. So obtaining money by false pretenses, pursuant to the Larceny Act.
Okay.
So this is where you intentionally defraud someone so as to get a benefit for yourself or for someone else. And that sounds like it fits.
Exactly. So if for whatever reason you use the child as a means to obtain money from the father for, over a period of time, over the years, etc., you can find a way to use that to prosecute the mother and,
Indeed.
Argument's sake.
Indeed. Again, I am not aware of any case that has actually been prosecuted.
We understand. I suppose, right.
Very well. And then you have, again, obtaining some benefit or property by false pretenses. And this now is not pursuant to the Larceny Act, but the Law Reform Fraudulent Transactions Special Provisions Act, a mouthful.
Yeah, right? For real.
And affectionately called the Lotto Scamming Act, right?
Okay.
So then that was what gave rise to that statute, where persons were, of course, obtaining money by fraud and trick. Now, in the second legislation, which is the Law Reform Fraudulent Transactions Special Provisions Act, obtaining property by false pretense, you have, for example, up to 20 years imprisonment.
Okay.
Yes,
I'm sure a couple people just do some eyebrow raising a while ago. You know what I mean? All right, keep talking.
Whereas under the Larceny Act, obtaining money by false pretense, that's a misdemeanor, and the maximum penalty will be a fine or 5 years.
Okay.
All right. Now, you also have the Registration of Birth and Deaths Act, mm-hmm. which speaks about making a false statement with respect to the registration, in this case, of a birth.
Right.
Yes. And that is also a crime.
Right. So, and just to be clear, essentially, basically, if you knowingly and willfully put the wrong information on a legal document,
yes,
that is a criminal offense. And,
Indeed.
In the case of this discussion, if you, put the wrong name in the father, exactly, that allows for some interpretation and perhaps some opportunity for a skillful lawyer like Miss Smith here to decide if we want to take a chance roll. Anyway, continue talking.
Yes, and the penalty in that event is $250,000 or 3 months imprisonment.
All right.
Under the Perjury Act, same principle. You're making a false declaration.
Right.
And in that event, well, the interesting thing about the Perjury Act is that you have to prosecute that matter within 3 years.
Okay.
So if the child is already 4 years,
exactly. So if he's, unfortunately, if the child is like, 3, 4, 10, 15, 20, that one might, but she did outline some other options. So keep listening,
indeed,
all right?
Indeed. And for that, the maximum penalty for that is 7 years maximum.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Good. So the truth is there are these different types of legislation that when you look at what paternity fraud entails,
the actual features of it, when you break it down into what actually took place and so on, right?
Indeed. Now, in England, there was a matter in 2017 whereby the court, again, it was in the context of making a false statement, right, and forging a document in relation to a paternity test. And there was an actual imprisonment of 12 months.
Okay. So there is some legal precedent, especially within the context of our jurisdiction,
right?
And
so
who
not in Jamaica,
but within the context of the British legal,
Commonwealth,
Commonwealth that we are a part of, so to speak.
Indeed. And in that case, it was particularly sad because, and this is just anecdotal, but the father had like a 12-inch tattoo of the child's name and date of birth on
his body, and
Indeed.
Emotional damage. All right. Continue.
Pretty much. So in the criminal area, again, no, I know you've prefaced the conversation by saying that you're a male and, you're aggrieved and you'd want to see justice done.
Right.
And we are discussing from the criminal law perspective. At the same time, I'm mindful of the fact that the father, or the putative father, is not the father anymore because he has now found out I'm not the father.
Exactly.
And so, I want justice. I'm wondering if perhaps the reason we don't have more cases of prosecution is the fact that if the mother is imprisoned,
who's going to look after the child? That is a serious consideration. If you are no longer the father and you feel that your emotional connection may have been severed, to be honest though, the actual answer is the child's real father, if you're really thinking about it. But, that's a conversation for another time. But,
been in the picture, perhaps you would have named him or her.
We'll never know because, anyway, continue. I don't, that's easy to walk down the road because it's easy to, we all know that there are many reasons why that paternity fraud option is chosen. Indeed. And anyway, but let's keep going.
Yeah, but it is a practical consideration, and so very often even he's no longer the father. So,
right.
But even the person who is aggrieved may say, well, I don't want this child to suffer. So even
that is true. That is true. Because in truth, the child is innocent. The child had nothing to do with any other whole situation. It's just, he's also a victim in this particular case, right?
Now, from the civil perspective, I mentioned the tort of deceit. So it's deception.
Right.
So in order to prove the elements of that particular cause of action, you'd have to show that there was a representation that was made, whether by conduct or action, that was untrue. It was made with the intention to deceive, in this case, deceive the father, right, or the person to thinking that he's the father. And it has, in fact, so induced the father or that person to act in the capacity of father, and he has suffered loss or damage as a result.
I was thinking about this, and this one is because I'm thinking to myself, I mean, I guess you can advise me, but isn't the very act of putting the wrong name, if, for example, in the context, I imagine if you know that is not the father,
right,
the very act of putting the wrong name on the birth certificate, wouldn't that be evidence in itself, in and of itself, to demonstrate that this was a fraudulent act?
The truth is, in our current setup, yes, and this is in the context of unmarried persons, generally speaking, the father would have had to have collaborated in order for their names to be on.
Is that so? So the father has to give permission to for this?
Generally speaking, right. Now, there is an exception whereby the mother alone can attend the Registrar General's department and make a certain declaration to say John is the father. Good. And then John would have to be served with notice that, listen,
Such and such is about to
register you as a father, you have 3 months to object.
Okay.
If he has in fact been served with that notice and does nothing, then the Registrar General is entitled to register him as a father.
To essentially legally assume that he's the father indeed.
Indeed. Now, if you have been served with notice and you do nothing, then to my mind that would have been irresponsible of you, especially if you genuinely believe it's not your child.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
At the same time, in other circumstances, like I said, in unmarried couples, the father would have had to have signed a declaration or would have done some act in collaboration with the mother so as to convince the registrar that indeed this is a person who's acknowledging or accepting that he's a father of the child.
Okay.
But to answer your question, if it is that he has attended because of what you would have said.
Exactly. If she has given him every reason to believe he is the father and he, in good faith, signs the birth certificate, but she, in the back of her mind, knows that, okay, this really isn't the guy, blah, blah, blah. I would imagine by virtue of that very act.
Indeed. That is some form of inducement and through misrepresentation. The challenge arises, though, with determining what we call the mens rea, the mental element associated with the offense. But we're in the context now, though, of civil law. But let's talk about the mental element, because to prove the tort of deceit, you have to show that there was an intentional, you knowingly...
There was intent, you willfully did
precisely,
this.
you knowingly
with intention
made that
to
false
deceive.
statement with the intention to deceive. Or you were reckless as to whether it was true or not. Now, what would meet that standard in paternity fraud cases? Is it that you'd say, well, if it is that you would have had more than one sexual partner within
the window of conception or whatever that is.
A month and a half? Is it 3 months? And, we had a lively debate at the office earlier this week on the matter, because the truth is you have persons who perhaps could be pregnant already and not seeing their period. You know what I mean? So there's so many nuances.
Different ways in which it could.
Am I really reckless if I didn't name John and I hadn't seen John in a whole month?
Exactly.
So the court would have to look at all the circumstances of the case. And again, the court also would have to look at whether you relied on that false statement or whether you had you formed your own view and did certain things. And again, although I'm not familiar with any cases in Jamaica, there is AVB in 2007 that was decided in England, and McGill in Australia in 2006. And in those cases, the court affirmed that and again, Commonwealth.
Right.
The court affirmed that there is a construct of the tort of deceit, and if you prove these elements, you can be entitled to compensation.
Okay, I like that. I'm sure everybody else just like that too. All right.
Right. So my research did not unearth any case in Jamaica whereby that was found. But the point is, the option exists.
Gentlemen.
So,
there is legal recourse. We need to start making some attempts to establish and set some precedents in this area. That's the only way things will really change, I mean, we can't just be upset, go rum bar, kiss your teeth, smoke whatever, and then just move on and be like, some people have to actually test the court. You have to actually take the matter to the court, see it through all the way, and that's the only way things will actually change. If we're serious about changing this and doing something about it, then, now is the time. All right.
Participate in the process. Of course, persons may say litigation is expensive and time consuming. And again, it could be that cases were brought before the court, but they're not reported.
Well, that's very true. That is very true. That is very true.
In the public domain, I did not unearth, find any such case.
That's very true.
Interestingly, one of the things that I found remarkable is the fact that the general position is that you're not able to recover for emotional distress.
Okay.
Because very often, I know the context may appear that we're talking about, we want back every cent that I've
exactly.
spent.
All of the money, all of the diaper, them and the ultrasound and the formula and all right, more back.
There you go. But there's also, and some persons may say, this don't apply to Jamaican men, and that's not true. There's also a mental distress element associated.
Absolutely.
And the cases I mentioned earlier envision that it is possible to get compensation for your mental anguish and distress. Of course, it has to be at a degree whereby, for example, it warranted some psychological intervention, you've got counseling and so on. Because this is, in some way, a type of bereavement.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the loss, you're grieving the loss of what would have been a very, very you know,
your legacy,
core relationship.
Yes.
It's not even just, it's the bond between father and child is one of the greatest, you know, I mean, parent and child, we don't even have to go, but just parent and child is one of the most, you know, personal and intense and deep and meaningful. And then for that to just get cut in one moment, emotional trauma.
Indeed.
All right, you know, it's important to specify that you were talking a while ago about single parents, because within the context of marriages, things change. Things are a little bit different. Because just correct me if I'm wrong, but under the law, any child born within the context of a marital union the father is deemed to be the father of that child. Notwithstanding whether the mother has been stepping out with Jerry next door or Keith round, whoever, whatever child born within the context of a marital union, the father is under the law deemed to be the father of that child. Am I right or am I right? Right.
Indeed, yes. So there is a presumption of paternity under the Status of Children Act that says that, yes, once the child is born during marriage or within even 10 months of the dissolution.
Oh, wow.
Then that husband or former husband is deemed to be the father.
All right. And so in which case, notwithstanding, you might know for a fact, you may have come home early and, you know, caught them in the act, whatever the case may be. And you know it's not you, but within the context of that union, and a child was produced, you're the father. And so what do you do? I mean, is there really no recourse in a situation like that?
Oh, certainly there is. So there's a presumption. A presumption can be rebutted.
Okay,
by
great.
appropriate evidence.
All right,
so,
good.
of course, if it is that DNA test is done and there's a declaration of paternity granted by the court, then certainly the matter will be determined in that way to say, well, then the husband is indeed not the father.
Okay.
And so in that context, an order would also be granted for the removal of his name from the birth certificate.
Okay, go on.
So I remember even in my experience, so after I gave birth, they didn't ask any questions of my husband.
But yeah, they typically don't.
So I just gave the information and the registration.
Just take it at face value that, okay, well, he's the husband, you're married, so naturally he must be the father of this child.
Indeed.
And that's just the assumptions that are made. And, you know, wow. Okay, which, you know, in which case the whole discussion of mandatory DNA testing, blah, 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 that is a conversation for another time. We'll go down that road another day. But, no, taking things into... So, I guess in your experience, how do we encourage men to... Because you said the options exist. But, you know, and I guess you speculated on it earlier in that many cases you don't what's going to happen to the child and who's going to look after the child if indeed they actually go through and prosecute the mother and leave the child, you know, unable to have a steady guardian available. But, you know, from where you sit as somebody who has been in the family law system and watching this happen, what would it take to get more of a groundswell, I suppose? I mean, it kind of sounds away when you say it like that, but, you know, to get more men involved in this process.
Well, the truth is, the court has a posture of generally not wanting to interfere in the domestic arrangements of people, right? And the thinking that, well, you know, we could open the floodgates if everyone approaches the court to determine these matters. But if there is a doubt, then there's a particular approach you could take. I think we would start with, first of all, getting a declaration of paternity. And you have different type of DNA tests. So if you do a personal DNA test, for example, and the result comes and says, oh, you're not the father, then in those circumstances, it can be the catalyst for you approaching the court for a formal declaration of paternity. But the court is going to order another paternity test, which has to be done in a particular way that accounts for chain of custody, proper IDs given in respect of the child, in respect of the parents, and so on.
So beyond the shadow of a doubt, just to make sure everything is perfectly perfect, right?
So yes, you may want to do a DNA test for your own purpose, but bear in mind that if you want it to be able to be used for court purposes, you have another more formal process, and that is the first step, right? So you can approach the court first, and then the court will say, go ahead now, go and get the DNA test done, and you indicate which institution you'll be using for that process. And then once the results come back, and there is in fact a declaration of paternity to say that you are not the father, then you would want to take steps to ensure that that birth certificate has been duly amended. Now, I know of cases where persons say, I'm not the father, but listen, after 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, we have already formed a bond. And especially if they don't have other children,
Okay.
Some men are like, okay, just leave it at
we're happy for those very altruistic men who have a very
Indeed.
special place in heaven put aside for them. We're very happy for them. But there are those of us, not us, talking about me.
Yes.
I think I'm embodying this thing a little bit too much. But there are those men who, because it may have been a tumultuous situation between them and the child's mother, and it was really acrimonious and things, the split was bad, and you know what I mean, and then to find out that they were not the child's parent all this time, they might choose to feel like, okay, I need to,
just clean break in all respects.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, in those cases, then fine, you go ahead, you follow through, have your name removed from the birth certificate. And the truth is, you can always adopt the child afterwards, legally. Yes, so that's also an option. Again, if you're interested in maintaining that
and the kind of relationship,
role,
yeah.
Indeed. At the end of the day, though, once your name remains on the birth certificate as father, the obligations under the Maintenance Act would apply.
Mm-hmm.
So you're required by law to maintain a child with respect to if your name is on the birth certificate, if you have accepted the child as a child of the family. And I think I want to spend a little time
let's talk about
that aspect of it as well, because the Maintenance Act doesn't only speak about you maintaining your biological child.
Okay.
Or a child in respect of whom your name is registered as father.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a child who has been accepted as a child of the family.
Specifically, what does that specifically mean exactly?
All right. So to be accepted as a child of the family means that both parties have treated the child in no different than you would your biological child.
Okay.
So in terms of their well-being, generally clothing, food, shelter, emotional support, and so on, once you've assumed those roles, even though it's not your child, then the obligation to maintain may exist. Now,
how you establish that? I mean, I don't understand, because I mean, let's say, is it a situation where it's a child that, what we call an outside child?
Yes.
You know what I mean? A man or woman gets a child outside, brings the child into the marital home, or the the communal home, if you will, and then that child grows alongside the others as.
Correct, with no distinction. That child is accepted as a child of the family, and you may be taking onto yourself obligations to maintain, even after your relationship with the mother has ended. Now, that may be a red flag for some people. Oh, so that means I shouldn't, take under my wing any child.
Exactly, because I did see something like this, like in a situation where a man was along with a lady, but eventually they mashed up. But while they were together, he was looking after her daughter as just looking after her as because he was the man in the house, so on and so forth. But when they left, I think it was this argument of how he's no longer providing, he's no longer helping her to support the child. And so that's what you mean in a situation like child of the family. So she could actually bring action to have him continue looking after a child that is not biologically his.
Correct. Of course, the court has to look at a wide cross-section of factors. Now, in matters pertaining to children generally, the welfare of the child is the first and paramount consideration. Right? That's pursuant to the Children, Guardianship and Custody Act. They're saying that whenever we talk about any application in relation to children, the welfare of the child or the well-being of the child is the first and paramount consideration. Okay. So, of course, the response will go and find the real father.
I think that's the automatic reaction, but continue.
Well, not necessarily so. Okay. Because if that child is you're the only father that child has ever known, and in the circumstances the court thinks it just to allow or to require you to continue making payments, the court can in fact do so. Now, sometimes the court may say, all right, I'm going to just make this order for 2 years while the mother goes and try and find the order.
Work or find whatever, or just get herself started.
Or find the real father, the biological father, So they might not necessarily make the order up to age 18. But it can be revisited after a certain period of time.
But at the
end of the day, the court is minded to protect the child. Now, there are some things that you could do, even outside of that context, where you could have a maintenance agreement. Or persons don't like the concept. Some persons, prenuptial or postnuptial agreement. But the law does allow for you to indicate what is the arrangement in respect of children while your relationship with the mother subsists, and also in the event that the relationship with the mother deteriorates or ends, what should happen there. So you can actually make agreements that would force.
But importantly, it is a situation, it doesn't necessarily just have to apply to married couples, meaning
Indeed.
a situation where I met you with a child and we get married, and then, even though you're not my child biologically, I still look after that child. And so when we leave now, I'm still required to look after that child. It's not my child, but we were married. So that kind of justifies things. But even if we weren't married, there's still a case can be made that I should continue. That is.
Well, of course, the court looks at several factors. Your ability to continue maintaining, your other obligations. Suppose you have other children. You follow me?
Right.
That, so there, I'm not saying it's automatic.
It's not automatic, but it's a consideration.
The court has a discretion in the circumstances. Now, my unofficial inquiries, with colleagues and jurists in the field, have yielded an interesting perspective and some of my own research as well. Whereby, what if you accepted a child as a child of the family, but only on the premise that you were the biological father? What should happen then?
Explain. That one requires a little more.
So let's say John meets Mary,
right?
And Mary already has a 3-year-old child.
Fine.
John knows that the child is not his.
Right.
But he accepts that child as a child of the family. His relationship with Mary ends. Arguably, he could still be asked to maintain that child. So he accepted the child of the family, knowing that the child wasn't really his. So persons feel a little bit more comfortable saying, well, I can accept then why the court might say, still continue to maintain that child, even for a period of time, because of those circumstances. No, some people say it's a horse of a different color.
Right.
If it is that John met Mary, and John and Mary are in a committed relationship, Mary gets pregnant. John assumes he's the father when he's not. The child is born. And because he thinks it's his child, he accepts the child as a child of the family.
Absolutely.
No. 3 years later, he gets a DNA test. He realizes that he's not the father anymore. Should this child still be a relevant child pursuant to the statute? Yes, he accepted the child as a child of the family, but only because he thought he was the father.
But that kind of brings us back to square one in our way. You know what I mean? In the sense that, now that I found that I'm not the father, I should not be the one to obligated to look after a child that is not biologically mine, because I entered the union on the assumption that whatever child produced would be mine.
All right, and one would think so. But I want to just raise, and I deliberately want to just intentionally read from an excerpt of a particular case, and this is a Jamaican case.
Okay.
Right, so it's the case of Lidstrom, and Lidstrom, in case anybody wants to do some research.
All right.
And in that case, they cited W&W 1971 All England Report at page 63. Now, in that case, that's a case from England. The facts of the case pretty similar. The father thought he was the biological father. Right. The husband thought he was a biological father. No. Justice Park, in that particular case, he made reference to an excerpt from Reading on Divorce. And this is the part that I think some persons might find a little concerning.
All right.
The knowledge or lack of knowledge possessed by one or both parties of the facts relating to the child, for example, as to the identity of its parents, would seem to be no longer material in determining whether it is a child of that family. It follows that a child who is a child of a wife and a man other than the husband would be a child of the family if he had been treated as such by both husband and wife, although the husband erroneously believed he was the father. And it would seem to be equally immaterial if the wife deliberately deceived the husband into such a belief. The child must, however, be treated as a child of the family by both parties.
No, sir.
No. So, of course, both persons are like, no.
No, sir.
I can't, I'm not.
That judge, respectfully, Your Honor, I disagree, okay? Obviously, the child was treated as a child of the family on the assumption that it was the father's child.
Indeed. And
so it seems like it's more from the perspective of the child. That's what that ruling seems to be doing. From the perspective of the child, you don't want to disenfranchise the child. You want to make sure that the child has some kind of safety. You know what I mean? Emotional, financial safety. Yeah. So you say, all right, let's continue making sure that you are looked after, which I think is a little bit unfair because that kind of overrules the man's emotional state. What kind of, you're just going to be like, it's no big deal, I don't mind. I'm going to just continue mine. No.
Yes. And in circumstances where this is suggesting the wife was intentionally
Exactly.
deceiving the person. You know, some person may say this is putting up, as we say in Jamaica, put up with slackness, encouraging slackness, you know. But the truth is, in the particular case, though, it was found that because the husband had moved out shortly after the birth of the child, yes, that he had not accepted that child as a child of the family, and so no order was made against it. But I was just saying, and of course I haven't seen it being appealed, but if he got the decision he wanted, he wouldn't really necessarily spend money on appeal. But it would be interesting to see how that would
work out in Jamaica. You know what I mean? That opens a whole heap of door. This subject is way deeper than we actually thought, people. I think we all just thought it was as black and white as, my child, not my child. My child, I look after it. Not my child, I don't. And that's the argument done. But then when you open the door from the perspective of what's best for the child, and if you are a judge whose whose primary concern is that, then a whole heap of other options
but of course
emerge.
Indeed. And most, well, I shouldn't say most, but it's possible though, and I'm not familiar with a case in Jamaica where the court has actually ordered someone who is not the father in circumstances where you're intentionally deceived. Otherwise,
it's just possible that maybe, unfortunately, maybe the situation, well, thankfully, it seems that maybe the ladies have not tested the system yet.
Indeed.
Which, this is not an encouragement for you to do that, by the way. But,
yes. Indeed. And the truth is sometimes, the mischief behind the statute about including persons children who were accepted as a child of the family, the thinking is, I accepted them knowing the child wasn't mine. But we do not believe that the mischief that the legislature was trying to prevent was in circumstances where you're intentionally deceived.
Exactly. There's no way that in drafting this law they would have been factoring in like, if she intentionally deceived the man, we're still going to make sure he has to pay her.
But again, I would love to see it tested in terms of, even on a matter of law, so we can get some guidance. But at the end of the day, though, parents have a great responsibility.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, our system isn't perfect. And at the end of the day, I believe both mother and father have a responsibility, yes, to maintain their children.
Absolutely.
But of course, as I say, the nuances.
The nuances come into play when, father may not be in the picture, father may not even be alive, all kinds of different things. And if you're looking at it from, like I said, from the perspective of the child, if your primary consideration is what's best for the child, how do we make sure that, notwithstanding the acrimonious relationship between the mother and the father and all of that, the child still get looked after? So whether you might like it or no, you're going to play daddy until at least for the next 2 years or however long they decide to make you have to pay these financial burdens and so on. And okay.
Yeah.
I wonder.
And bear in mind for maintenance, if you do not make your maintenance payments when you should, and you've willfully failed to make those payments, then you can even be committed to prison.
Exactly. I've heard number of stories.
Yes. So it's unfortunate if I am liable to imprisonment in respect of a child that is not mine. Right. You can see how egregious
that's truly, and that's one of the things I was working on. I mean, in cases, for example, you did mention that, imagine situations where you find out that you're not the father after you had such a bad relationship with the mother and because you don't make the maintenance payment and you end up in jail and all these things and all. So I guess it's really up to the men to test the system to see if they can recoup whatever you get for emotional damage and all of those things that they would have probably suffered in the past. Because we know there are many men who have found themselves in jail and not paying maintenance payments. We know that. That's a fact.
Yes.
And, so, like I said, you just kind of blow my mind. Like I just really thought it was black and white.
No, but not at all. And in fairness, though, this would perhaps take us in a whole other discussion. But other orders in respect of that said child as a child of the family. What about custody?
Yeah.
Suppose the father is saying, well, the person who thought he was a father is, I have grown so attached to this child. As a matter of fact, I'm actually the better parent.
Okay.
What if I want to apply for custody?
Exactly. And then who deserves custody of the biological biology over, relationship or nurture, that kind of thing. Okay.
Yeah, so there's so many different permutations that can arise. And again, it's just for us to test them in the courts and see.
Yeah. Okay. You know what? I don't think I want to go too much further than where we are right here. You're giving us a whole lot to think about and review and so on. And yeah, wow, I don't even know if normally this is where I would go back to the start, but I think we've covered so much ground that but we can just rehash quickly some of the I guess options that persons have. You find out that you're not the father, or your child is not yours. You thought it was yours. What legal recourse do I have? Let's just start there, and then we can kind of bring the curtains down after.
Very well. So again, and just to go a little even further back. Again, if you have any doubts or any concerns, or if you just want to be sure, there is always the option of approaching the court for a declaration of paternity. All right. But let's say we find out now that you're not the father. What are the options available to you? So in terms of your own compensation, for example, for maintenance payments that you would have made in the past, again, not necessarily tested in our jurisdiction based on reported case law, but the option does exist in relation to the tort of deceit. Yes. Again, you have to meet all the elements.
Right.
Yes. So the false statement was made with certain intention, knowingly, to induce you to act in a particular way. You have in fact acted and you've suffered loss. Right. So it is possible, for example, in one of the cases out of England, whereby the court found that yes, he may have suffered loss, but he did not rely on the false representation of the mother. He, of his own, had done certain things based on his evidence that he gave.
Okay.
So he didn't actually rely on the false statement, and so he couldn't recover in that case.
Oh, wow.
Yes, so outside of this civil matters, that would be basically the father or the person who was found out he's not the father suing the mother. In a civil trial. Now, in relation to the criminal arena, there are various legislations that can apply. If you make a false declaration in the birth certificate, if it is that you have obtained monies by false pretenses under the Larceny Act or under the Law Reform Fraudulent Transactions Special Provisions Act. So though you could make a report to the police, but again, I'm not necessarily seeing where the police is going to actually prosecute the matter. It is possible, though. And so the options exist. Again, I did say if the mother is in fact prosecuted and is imprisoned, what then would happen with respect to the child and so on. So it is not, as you mentioned, black and white. Right. There are many permutations, many considerations that the court will have to make. But certainly, even as adults, we too have to exercise our discretion and determine. I know even when emotions are high and we're frustrated, I've observed a tribunal indicating to a person who is no longer deemed to be the father, and he said, what happens now? And the tribunal simply indicated, well, now you know you're not the father, basically go thy way and give thanks. Yes, because sometimes to bring this before the court and keep it prolonged and so on, it might not really be helping the child. And the truth is, if the mother is impecunious or a woman of straws, we say not able to afford it, if you've paid 10 years of maintenance, even using a relatively modest sum per week, you multiply that times 52 per year, and then per the number of years that you've been doing it, what are the odds that she'll have that money to be able to pay you back?
But what are you never have the money in the first place? You had to work and struggle and sacrifice to make the maintenance payments under threat of going to jail.
Indeed, that
so
is
there's
true
some equity have to be balanced back up.
Indeed, but you may end up getting a judgment and it's a piece of paper, can't be enforced because she's not able to afford it. And the monies that she would now be paying to you would be taken from the mouths of the children. Right. Again, you might say, well, I don't care about that because, I
had to do the same.
Indeed, yes. So, but again, at the end of the day, I'll only say this, that children did not invite themselves into the world. Children are brought into the world by the decisions of adults. And so I encourage all adults to act responsibly and transparently so that at the end of the day, the welfare of the children will be protected.
You know what? I think I'm going to stop right there.
We are in Child's Month after all.
We might have to invite you back. Our audience, let us know if you loved all the things that Miss Shuana Kay Smith has to say. If we want to bring her back so we can keep the conversation going, not our problem, because she definitely gave us some very interesting things to chew on. You know what I mean? We are, like I said, I know for a fact I thought it was a black and white issue. I am or I'm not, and if I'm not, give me back my money. You know what I mean? And now that we have, when you really factor in the perspective of the child and what's in the best interest of the child and how to proceed, then things change. And, if you really care about the welfare of the child and so on and that kind of thing, those considerations matter. It might very well mean that you end up eating your anger, your hate, and your resentments for the best interest of the child. Is that fair? I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know. That's a decision every individual will have to make for themselves. But this is definitely has been a very enlightening look at the paternity fraud issue in the country. All right. Well, you know what? With that said, I think it's time for us to wrap. Thank you to everyone who tuned into our discussion, especially if you dropped a comment down below. We really, really appreciate that. And if you have more questions, keep them coming so that we can keep the conversation going, all right? Now, remember, our audience plays a major part in our show. So if there's anyone in particular you'd like us to have in studio, let us know. We'll try to have that person in studio as soon as possible. Don't forget to follow us online on all the various platforms, TikTok, Instagram, X, you name it, we're there, Jamaica Information Service. In the meantime, don't be afraid to look up Miss Smith. I don't know if you can just plug yourself, give us where people can find you.
Well, so we have a website, www.sasalegal.com, and also our Instagram page, LinkedIn page at SasaLegalJA. So that's Shuana Kay Smith and Associates, and we're located at 49.5 Upper Waterloo Road. Our practice areas include family law, real estate law, administration of estates and estate planning, as well as commercial law. And we look forward to collaborating with you.
Right, exactly. There you go. I mean,
and let us know if you want us to discuss other topics as
Absolutely.
well.
You know what I mean? If there's anything else you want to, it sounds like you know a whole heap of things. It's only natural that when you're thinking about things like paternity and so on, and estates become out. And whenever we have the Administrator General's Department here, conversation always gets spicy. So there's always a lot to talk about where that is concerned, and so much more. All right. But we do this live online. This has been Studio 58A, your online discussion program coming right here from the Jamaica Information Service. I've been your host, Vaughn Davis. Thank you so much for paying attention to us, and please have a wonderful rest of the day. Take care.